Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back to a time when the glow of the forge was both salvation and burden, when the ring of the anvil marked the heartbeat of entire villages, and when a single pair of calloused hands could shape the very tools that built civilizations. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's strangely comforting to see how many of us are drifting off together from different corners of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum. And let's settle in for tonight's quiet journey through history. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Feel yourself sinking back, not just into your pillow, but into time itself. We're traveling to a medieval village, perhaps in England or France, sometime in the 13th or 14th century. The morning mist clings to thatched roofs like a soft gray blanket. And somewhere in the distance, a rooster announces the reluctant arrival of another day. But you are already awake. You've been awake for what feels like hours, listening to the subtle sounds that mark the transition from night to day. And soon, very soon, you'll rise to tend the forge that has been your constant companion, your burden and your livelihood for as long as you can remember. The first sensation that greets you each morning isn't the warmth of sunlight or the comfort of your straw mattress. It's the ache, deep in your shoulders, radiating down through your arms, settling into your lower back like an unwelcome guest who has overstayed by decades. Your hands, even in sleep, seem to remember the weight of the hammer. Fingers curled as if still gripping worn leather wrapped around weathered wood. You shift on your simple bed, rough wool blankets over straw that has grown thin and brittle with use. The air in your modest dwelling carries the perpetual scent of your trade, cold ash, lingering smoke, and the metallic temps of iron that has seeped so deeply into the very walls that even winter rains cannot wash it away. Outside, the village is beginning to stir. You can hear the soft shuffle of feet on dirt paths, the gentle lowing of cattle being led to pasture, the distant creak of cartwheels that you yourself have fitted with iron bands. But these sounds are secondary to the call that draws you from your bed, the cold, patient forge that waits in the workshop attached to your home. The workshop is small, barely large enough for the essentials. Your forge, your anvil, your bellows, and the collection of tools that represent not just your trade, but your very identity. The forge sits cold and dark now, a circular stone hearth filled with the gray remnants of yesterday's fire. Beside it, the great leather bellows hangs limp and silent like the lungs of some sleeping beast. You know the routine so well, you could perform it in complete darkness, and often do, during the shorter days of winter. First, the careful arrangement of charcoal and wood, building the foundation for the fire that will be your constant companion for the next 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours. The charcoal is expensive, each piece precious, rationed carefully because your earnings barely cover the cost of materials, let alone the luxuries that other craftsmen might enjoy. As you work, your breath creates small clouds in the morning air. The workshop offers little protection from the elements, a roof overhead, walls that keep out the worst of the wind, but nothing that could be called comfort. In winter, the cold seeps through every gap in the stone and timber, making your fingers stiff and clumsy until the forge warms. In summer, the heat becomes nearly unbearable, the air thick and stifling. Your clothes soaked with sweat before the sun has fully risen. The bellows require their own rhythm, their own patience. You pump them slowly, steadily, feeding air to the carefully arranged fuel. Gradually, reluctantly, the fire begins to catch. First a thin wisp of smoke, then the gentle crackle of kindling, and finally, the deeper, more substantial roar as the charcoal ignites. The transformation is almost magical. This cold, lifeless hearth becoming a source of intense heat and light, capable of softening the hardest iron. But magic comes at a cost. As the fire grows stronger, so does the smoke. It fills the workshop with a thick, acrid haze that makes your eyes water and your lungs burn. Over the years, you've learned to breathe shallowly, to work with minimal inhalation. Still, the smoke finds its way into every part of you. Your clothes reek of it, your hair holds the scent for days, and visitors to your home know immediately what you do for a living before you've spoken a word. The heat, when it comes, arrives like a physical presence. It presses against your face, radiates through your clothing, makes the air itself seem thick and heavy. In the depths of winter, this warmth is welcome, almost comforting. But as the seasons change, as spring gives way to summer, the forge becomes an adversary. The heat that you need to work the iron becomes an enemy that saps your strength, makes every movement an effort, turns the simple act of breathing into a conscious struggle. Your first piece of work today, like every day, is practical, mundane, essential. Perhaps horseshoes, those simple curved pieces of iron that protect the hooves of the village's most valuable animals. The iron begins as a rough bar, dark and cold and stubborn. You place one end into the heart of the fire, watching as the metal slowly changes color. From black to deep red to bright orange to the pale yellow that tells you it's ready to work. The hammer feels heavier each year, though you know its weight hasn't changed. It's your body that's different. Your shoulders that protest more loudly. Your grip that requires more conscious effort to maintain. The first strike sends vibrations up through your arm. A reminder of the thousands upon thousands of similar strikes you've made, each one leaving its mark not just on the iron, but on your bones, your joints, your very essence. The rhythm begins slowly, carefully. No strike, turn, strike, turn. Oh, the iron gradually takes shape under your guidance, but it's reluctant, requiring patience and persistence and a kind of gentle violence. Each blow must be placed precisely. Too soft and the metal won't move. Too hard and it might crack or fold in ways that cannot be undone. This is the skill that separates a true blacksmith from someone merely wielding a hammer. The ability to read the metal, to understand its moods and temperament, to coax it into the shape you need. As you work, sparks fly from the anvil like tiny stars, brief flashes of light that dance through the smoky air before dying on the packed earth floor. Some land on your clothes, leaving small burn holes that accumulate over time until your garments become a record of your labor. Others find their way to exposed skin, your forearms, your hands, sometimes your face if you lean too close to your work. The pain is sharp but brief, and you've long since learned to ignore these small injuries. Your hands and arms bear the permanent marks of your trade, small scars, patches of skin that heal darker or lighter, the calluses that have built up like armor over the years. The horseshoe takes shape gradually. What began as a straight bar of iron curves under your hammer, developing the characteristic U-shape that will cradle a horse's hoof. You form the nail holes with careful precision, each one placed exactly where it needs to be. Each one the right size to accept the square-headed nails that will hold the shoe in place. This is detailed work, requiring you to heat and reheat the iron to work quickly before it cools and becomes stubborn again. When the first horseshoe is complete, you set it aside and begin the next, and then the next. A horse needs 4 shoes, and there are several horses in the village, and the shoes wear out with use, requiring replacement every few months. This is steady work, reliable income, but it's also repetitive in a way that can make the hours blur together. Strike, turn, heat, shape, cool, set aside. The rhythm becomes almost meditative, your mind free to wander while your hands continue their familiar dance. The village priest stops by as you're finishing the second shoe. He's a thin man with soft hands who always seems slightly uncomfortable in your smoky workshop, but he needs your services like everyone else. A hinge for the church door has broken, and he wonders if you might have time to forge a replacement. You nod, wiping sweat from your forehead with the back of your hand. Adding his request to the mental list of tasks that never seems to grow shorter. The priest pays in coin when he can, but often your payment comes in other forms. Vegetables from someone's garden, a measure of grain, perhaps a small wheel of cheese if you're fortunate. Money is scarce in the village, but everyone needs your services, so you've learned to accept what people can offer. Sometimes it's enough, sometimes it isn't, but you continue working because the alternative. Letting the forge go cold, abandoning the only trade you know, is unthinkable. As the morning progresses into afternoon, the heat becomes more oppressive. Our clothes stick to your skin, and the constant pumping of the bellows makes your shoulders ache in new and creative ways. You pause occasionally to drink water from a wooden bucket, but the relief is temporary. The fire demands constant attention, constant feeding, and the iron requires precise timing that cannot be delayed for comfort. A farmer arrives with a broken plowshare, the iron blade that breaks the soil and makes agriculture possible. It's cracked along one edge, probably from striking a hidden stone, and without it, its ability to prepare his fields for planting is severely compromised. This is more complex work than horseshoes, the plowshare must be not just repaired but strengthened, welded back together in a way that will withstand the tremendous forces it will face when dragged through hard earth. You heat the damaged area until both pieces of iron glow white hot, then carefully bring them together on the anvil. The welding process requires perfect timing and temperature. Too cool and the pieces won't fuse, too hot and the iron will burn and weaken. You work quickly, but carefully, hammering the joint while the metal is at exactly the right heat, watching for the subtle signs that tell you the weld is taking hold. The repair takes most of the afternoon, and by the time you're finished, your back feels as if someone has been using it as an anvil. You arch backward, trying to stretch muscles that have been hunched over your work for hours, and feel the familiar pop and crack of joints that have endured too much repetitive stress. The farmer examines your work with satisfaction, pays you with a promise of grain after the harvest, and departs with the restored plowshare cradled carefully in his arms. Evening approaches, but your work is far from finished. The village lord's steward has sent word that several weapons need sharpening and repair. Swords that have grown dull, spear points that have bent in training. This is prestigious work, better paying than horseshoes or farm tools, but it's also more demanding. A sword must be perfectly balanced, its edge keen enough to cut, but not so thin that it will chip or break in battle. You'll work by firelight and candlelight to complete these orders, the orange glow of the forge casting dancing shadows on the workshop walls. As you prepare for the evening's labor, you reflect on the day that's past and the day that's coming. Tomorrow will bring more of the same: horseshoes, tools, repairs. The endless cycle of heating and hammering that has defined your life for as long as you can remember. Your father was a blacksmith, and his father before him, and you've trained your eldest son in the trade because this is what your family does, what your family has always done. The work is hard, harder than most people realize. They see the finished products, the gleaming horseshoes, the sharp-edged tools, the carefully wrought hinges and nails that hold their world together, but they don't see the daily cost of creating them. They don't feel the ache in your shoulders, or the burn of sparks on your skin. They don't breathe the smoke or endure the heat or wrestle with iron that seems determined to remain shapeless and stubborn. Yet there's something in this work that goes beyond mere survival, something that keeps you returning to the forge each morning, despite the pain and exhaustion. Perhaps it's the satisfaction of transformation, taking crude iron and shaping it into something useful, something necessary. Perhaps it's the knowledge that your work supports the entire village, that without your skills, the farmers couldn't farm. The horses couldn't travel, the doors couldn't close securely at night. Or perhaps it's simply that this is who you are. Your hands know the weight of the hammer. Your eyes can judge the heat of iron by its color. Your ears can distinguish between the clear ring of good metal and the dull thunk that indicates a flaw. This knowledge came at a price: years of learning, decades of practice, a lifetime of small injuries and accumulating fatigue, but it's yours in a way that nothing else can be. The day ends as it began, with the gradual banking of the fire, the careful arrangement of tools, the slow transition from the bright, harsh world of the workshop to the quieter rhythms of evening. Your clothes are filthy, your hands blackened, your body tired in ways that only other smiths can truly understand. Tomorrow, you'll wake to the same ache, the same routine, the same patient fire, waiting to be coaxed back to life. But tonight, for just a few hours, the hammer rests silent, the anvil grows cool, and you can let yourself forget the weight of iron and the heat of flame. Tonight, you can simply be human, rather than the extension of your tools that you become during the long hours of labor. The rhythm of your days continues, as steady and reliable as the ring of hammer on anvil, as constant as the need for iron in a world built on metal and fire, and the patient skill of hands that have learned to shape both. As the sun fades and settles into evening, let's shift our attention from the village forge to the quiet cloisters of a medieval monastery, where another kind of blacksmith plied his trade, not for coin or grain, but for the glory of God and the preservation of sacred knowledge. In the early 12th century, somewhere in the monasteries of Europe, perhaps in Germany, perhaps in France, the exact location lost to time like smoke from a long cold forge, there lived a monk known to us only as Theophilus Presbyter. His given name has vanished into history, but his legacy remains in the pages of a remarkable manuscript, Schedula Diversarum Artium, or on Divers Arts. one of the most detailed accounts of medieval craftsmanship ever written. Imagine yourself in his world, if you will. The monastery bells marking the hours of prayer, the soft shuffle of sandaled feet on stone floors, the whispered Latin of morning devotions echoing through corridors that had witnessed countless generations of faithful monks. But beneath these sounds of spiritual life runs another rhythm, the familiar ring of hammer on anvil. The whoosh of bellows breathing life into glowing coals, the hiss of hot metal meeting water in the quenching bath. For in these sacred spaces, metalworking was not merely a trade, but a form of prayer made manifest in iron and bronze and precious metals. The monastery itself stood as a monument to both faith and industry, its thick stone walls rising from carefully tended grounds where vegetable gardens flourished alongside workshops and scriptoriums. Within these walls, the division between sacred and secular work had blurred into something altogether more profound. A recognition that skilled labor, performed with devotion and attention, was itself a pathway to the divine. The rhythmic hammering from the forge provided a counterpoint to the Gregorian chant that floated from the chapel, creating a symphony of human endeavor that spoke to both earthly necessity and heavenly aspiration. Theophilus was both monk and master craftsman, a man who understood that the creation of beautiful, functional objects was itself a form of worship. His hands, like those of our village blacksmith, were stained with soot and marked by countless small burns, each scar a testament to lessons learned through trial and error. But the items he crafted served a different purpose. Not horseshoes for workhorses, but liturgical vessels for the celebration of Mass, not plowshares for turning soil, but bells whose voices would carry prayers across valleys and hills, becoming part of the very landscape of faith. The education that brought Theophilus to his calling was unlike that of any secular craftsman. He had likely entered the monastery as a young boy, perhaps the second or third son of a noble family, seeking to place their child in service to God. His early years would have been spent learning Latin, studying scripture, and participating in the endless cycle of prayer that defined monastic life. But somewhere along the way, an aptitude for working with metal had revealed itself. Perhaps in the careful repair of a damaged crucifix, or the successful mending of a broken bell clapper. The monastery forge where Theophilus worked would have been larger than our village smith's humble workshop, but the fundamental challenges remained the same. The fire still needed constant tending, the iron still resisted shaping, the work still demanded strength and skill and endless patience. What made his situation unique was not the absence of hardship, but the context in which that hardship was endured. Surrounded by brothers who understood that suffering, whether physical or spiritual, could be transformed into something meaningful through proper attention and devotion. The forge itself occupied a position of honor within the monastery complex, often located near the chapel, so that the sounds of prayer and metalworking could mingle naturally. The building was constructed with the same attention to detail as the church itself, stone walls that would endure for centuries, carefully designed ventilation to carry away harmful fumes, and windows positioned to provide optimal light for detailed work. The anvil, that essential foundation of all metalworking, stood upon a massive block of stone or hardwood, its surface polished smooth by countless hours of use. In his writings, Theophilus reveals the deep weariness that came with his craft, but also the profound satisfaction of work performed in service of something greater than personal gain. He writes of the necessity of patience, of the many failures that precede success, of the burns and bruises that mark the serious craftsman. Do not grow weary, he counsels future generations of metalworkers, for the learning of this art requires much time and much suffering of the flesh. His words carry the weight of experience, the knowledge that comes only from years spent in the company of fire and iron. Learning to read the subtle language of glowing metal and dancing flames, the spiritual dimension of Theophilus's work extended far beyond the mere creation of religious objects. Each piece he crafted was an act of devotion, a physical prayer shaped in metal and offered to God. The patience required for detailed work became a form of meditation. The repetitive motions of hammering and filing a rhythm that calmed the mind and opened the heart to divine inspiration. In this way, the monastery forge became a place of spiritual practice as much as physical labor, where the transformation of raw materials paralleled the ongoing transformation of the human soul. The bell foundry was perhaps the most challenging aspect of Theophilus's work. requiring not just skill, but an understanding of mathematics, acoustics, and metallurgy that few possessed even among educated monks. The process began months before the actual casting, with the careful preparation of materials and the construction of elaborate clay molds. The bronze itself, an alloy of copper and tin, had to be acquired from distant mines and trading networks that connected the monastery to the wider medieval economy. Creating a church bell was as much art as science, requiring an intimate understanding of how different proportions and thicknesses would affect the final tone. Theophilus would begin by creating a detailed clay model, carefully calculating the dimensions needed to produce the desired pitch and resonance. The bell's voice had to complement the existing bells in the tower, creating harmonious combinations that would enhance rather than clash with the established musical patterns of the monastic day. The clay mold itself was a masterpiece of engineering, constructed in layers with channels for the molten bronze to flow and vents for trapped air to escape. The outer surface was carefully shaped to create the decorative elements that would adorn the finished bell. Inscriptions in Latin requesting divine blessing, images of saints and angels, patterns that spoke to both artistic sensibility and spiritual significance. Each detail had to be formed in reverse, requiring Theophilus to think backwards through the casting process, visualizing the final product while working with its negative image. Theophilus describes the anxiety of those crucial moments when months of preparation hung in the balance of a single pour. The bronze, heated in a specially constructed furnace to temperatures that could melt copper and tin into a flowing river of molten metal, glowed like captured sunlight. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the metal might not flow properly. Too late, and it might begin to solidify before the mold was completely filled. The margin for error was almost non-existent, and failure meant not just lost time and materials, the disappointment of an entire monastic community that had invested their hopes and prayers in the project. The actual casting was a community event, with monks gathering to witness the dramatic moment when months of preparation culminated in the birth of a new voice for their tower. The furnace had to be heated for hours beforehand, tended constantly to maintain the exact temperature needed for a successful pour. As the moment approached, Theophilus would test the bronze with iron rods, watching for the particular way the molten metal flowed that indicated readiness. Then, with prayers on every lip, the furnace would be tapped, and the bronze would flow like liquid fire into the waiting mold. When successful, however, the results were magnificent. The newly cast bell, once freed from its clay prison and carefully tuned by filing and grinding, would possess a voice that could be heard for miles. Theophilus understood that this voice would become part of the landscape, marking the hours of prayer, calling the faithful to worship, announcing celebrations, and mourning the dead. In creating these bronze voices, he was crafting the very soundtrack of medieval spiritual life, sounds that would echo across valleys and centuries. But bells were only one aspect of his craft. Theophilus also created chalices for the celebration of Mass, their surfaces decorated with intricate patterns hammered from the reverse side in a technique called. This work required not just the brute strength needed for heavy forging, but a delicate touch and artistic sensibility that came only through years of practice. Each small hammer blow had to be precise, gradually building up the relief decoration without tearing or distorting the thin, precious metal. The creation of a single chalice might take weeks or even months, depending on the complexity of its decoration. Theophilus would work by candlelight in the long winter evenings, his eyes straining to see the fine details, his shoulders aching from hunching over the delicate work. The gold and silver he worked with were precious beyond measure, often donated by wealthy patrons seeking to secure prayers for their souls. Any mistake might be irreparable, requiring him to melt down weeks of work and begin again. The pressure was constant, the concentration exhausting. Yet the finished product would serve the most sacred function imaginable, holding the wine that would become, through the mystery of transubstantiation, the blood of Christ. Each chalice was unique, reflecting not only Theophilus's technical skill, but also his understanding of Christian symbolism and iconography. The base might be decorated with images of the four evangelists, their symbols worked in delicate relief around the circumference. The bowl itself might bear inscriptions from the Psalms or the Gospels, the Latin letters formed with a precision that spoke to both literacy and artistic sensibility. The stem would be carefully proportioned to provide stability while allowing the priest, to hold the vessel comfortably during the sacred ritual. The manuscript that preserves Theophilus's knowledge for us reveals not just technical instructions, but glimpses of the man himself. He writes with the voice of experience, warning about common mistakes, sharing hard-won insights about temperature and timing and technique. When he describes the proper way to anneal copper, heating it to relieve internal stresses that could cause cracking, he mentions almost casually the importance of working in a space with good ventilation, suggesting long experience with the effects of metalworking fumes on human health. His instructions for creating different alloys reveal a deep understanding of metallurgy that could only have come from years of experimentation and careful observation. He knew which combinations of metals would produce specific colors and working properties, knowledge that represented the accumulated wisdom of generations of craftsmen. He understood that adding zinc to copper would create brass with its distinctive golden color, that varying the proportions of tin and bronze would affect both its hardness and its musical qualities. This was not theoretical knowledge learned from books, but practical understanding earned through countless hours at the forge, countless small failures and hard-won successes. The social position of a monastic craftsman like Theophilus was complex and sometimes contradictory. On one hand, his skills were valued, and his work celebrated as contributing to the glory of God. The beautiful objects he created were treasured, displayed prominently in the church, admired by pilgrims and fellow monks alike. His expertise earned him a measure of respect within the monastic community, and his opinion was sought on matters relating to construction and decoration throughout the monastery complex. Yet he remained bound by vows of poverty and obedience, unable to profit personally from his considerable talents, where a secular craftsman of similar skill might accumulate wealth and eventually establish his own workshop with apprentices and assistants. Theophilus could aspire only to spiritual rewards. The monastery provided him with food, shelter, and clothing, but these were simple fare: coarse bread, thin soup, rough wool robes that offered little protection from the heat of the forge or the cold of winter. His hands, like those of our village blacksmith, bore the permanent marks of his trade, yet where the village smith might at least hope for a measure of prosperity as his skills developed, Theophilus's rewards were entirely spiritual. The irony was not lost on him that he created objects of great beauty and value while living in deliberate simplicity. The chalices he crafted might be worth more than a peasant family could earn in a lifetime, yet he owned nothing beyond his tools and the rough clothing on his back. This tension between the material richness of his creations and the poverty of his personal circumstances was resolved through faith. The understanding that true wealth lay not in possessions, but in the opportunity to serve God through the exercise of divine gifts. Yet in his writings, there's little sense of complaint or resentment. He seems to have found genuine satisfaction in the marriage of craft and devotion, in the knowledge that his skills served a purpose larger than personal gain. The ringing of bells he had cast would call generations of monks to prayer. The chalices he had shaped would serve the Mass for decades or centuries to come. His was work that would outlast him, work that connected him to both his predecessors and his successors in a chain of craftsmanship that stretched back to antiquity and forward into an unknowable future. The daily rhythm of Theophilus's life would have been punctuated by the canonical hours, the regular intervals of communal prayer that structured monastic life. 7 times each day, the bells would ring, and he would set aside his hammer, wash the soot from his hands as best he could, and join his brothers in the chapel for psalms and prayers. These interruptions might have seemed disruptive to urgent work, but they also provided necessary rest for eyes strained by close work and backs bent over the anvil. The brief respite allowed muscles to relax and minds to refresh, often returning to work with new clarity and energy. Prime at daybreak found him already at work, taking advantage of the cool morning air before the forge heated up. Terse at mid-morning provided a break when the day's work was well underway. Sext at noon came when the heat was often becoming unbearable, making the call to prayer a welcome relief. None in mid-afternoon, vespers at evening, compline before sleep, each provided their own rhythm to the working day, creating a pattern that honored both spiritual obligation and practical necessity. The changing seasons brought their own challenges and rhythms to monastery life. Winter meant shorter days and the constant struggle to keep the forge fire burning efficiently. while conserving fuel. The stone walls of the monastery workshops provided better protection from the elements than a village smith's simple shelter, but they also trapped cold air that made early morning work particularly challenging. Theophilus would have faced the same struggle as smiths everywhere: the need to warm both workspace and materials before serious work could begin. The way cold metal resisted shaping, the increased consumption of charcoal needed to maintain working temperatures. The monastery's resources provided some advantages during the harsh winter months. Unlike village smiths, who might struggle to obtain adequate fuel, Theophilus could rely on the monastery's extensive woodlands and the organized labor of lay brothers to ensure a steady supply of charcoal. The community's wealth also meant access to better tools and materials, imported items that might be impossible for an individual craftsman to afford. Yet winter still brought its challenges: shorter working days, the difficulty of heating large workshop spaces. The way cold made precision work more difficult as fingers grew stiff and numb. Spring brought renewal, but also increased demands. Easter was the most important celebration of the Christian year. Preparations might include the creation of new liturgical vessels, the repair of existing pieces damaged by a year's use, or the casting of special ceremonial bells. The pressure to complete these projects on time, combined with the increased religious observances of Lent and Holy Week, would have made this a particularly intense period in the monastery forge. Yet spring also brought longer days and milder temperatures that made intensive work more bearable. The symbolic significance of working with metal during the Easter season would not have been lost on Theophilus. The transformation of base materials into objects of beauty and function paralleled the spiritual transformation promised by Christ's resurrection. The fire of the forge became a metaphor for purification and renewal. The hammering and shaping of metal, a reflection of how divine grace worked upon the human soul. In creating new vessels for the Easter liturgy, Theophilus participated in the fundamental Christian mystery of death and rebirth, darkness and light. Summer offered the blessing of longer days, but also the challenge of working in oppressive heat. The thick stone walls that provided winter protection now trapped the heat of both forge and season, creating working conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Temperatures in the workshop could soar well above what was comfortable for human habitation, yet the work had to continue. Theophilus would have learned to schedule his heaviest work for the cooler hours of early morning and late evening, using the hottest part of the day for finishing work that required less heat, or for the preparation of materials that could be done away from the forge. The monastery's resources again provided some mitigation of summer's challenges. Unlike village smiths who might have only crude shelters, Theophilus worked in a stone building designed with ventilation in mind. High windows and carefully positioned openings allowed hot air to rise and escape, while drawing in whatever cooling breezes might be available. The proximity to other buildings also provided some shade during the hottest parts of the day. Yet even these advantages could not entirely overcome the fundamental challenge of working with fire during the heat of summer. Autumn brought a different kind of urgency. The need to complete projects before winter made intensive work more difficult. It was also the time for gathering and preparing materials: charcoal for the forge, clay for molds, the various minerals and chemicals needed for different metallurgical processes. The monastery's relative wealth and connections meant Theophilus had access to materials that a village smith could only dream of: pure copper from mines in Central Europe, tin from Cornwall, even small quantities of precious metals donated by wealthy patrons seeking to secure prayers for their souls. The harvest season also brought increased activity throughout the monastery, as crops were gathered and preserved for the winter months ahead. This created additional demands on Theophilus's time, as agricultural tools needed repair and maintenance after the intensive work of harvest. Scythes required sharpening, plowshares needed mending, and all the metal implements of rural life demanded attention. Yet this seasonal work also provided variety in the satisfaction of creating tools that would serve the monastery's agricultural needs. The loneliness of craft work was perhaps less acute for Theophilus than for our village blacksmith. The monastery was a community, and even when working alone at the forge, he was surrounded by the sounds and rhythms of communal life. The chanting from the chapel, the conversations of monks walking between buildings, the sounds of other workshops where scribes copied manuscripts and carpenters shaped wood, all provided a sense of shared purpose and mutual support. Yet the specialized nature of his skills still set him apart. Most of his fellow monks could not fully appreciate the subtleties of his work. The delicate balance of heat and timing that made the difference between success and failure. They might admire the finished products, a beautifully decorated chalice, or a bell with a particularly pure tone, but they could not understand the weeks or months of patient labor that went into each creation. In a community where most work was either agricultural or intellectual, the physical demands and technical complexities of metalworking remained somewhat mysterious. This isolation of expertise created its own burdens. When problems arose, a cracked bell, a chalice that leaked at the seams, an alloy that refused to flow properly, there were few, if any, peers to consult. Theophilus had to rely on his own experience and judgment, making decisions that could affect projects representing months of work and considerable expense. The weight of responsibility was considerable, especially when working with precious materials donated by wealthy patrons who expected perfection in return for their generous gifts. In his manuscript, Theophilus occasionally reveals the isolation that came with expertise. He writes for future craftsmen, hoping to pass on knowledge that might otherwise die with him. There's a poignancy in this. The recognition that skills acquired over decades of dedicated practice might disappear entirely if not carefully preserved and transmitted. He was acutely aware that he was a keeper of knowledge, responsible not just for his own work, but for ensuring that future generations would have access to the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The process of writing his manual was itself a form of craft, requiring the same patience and attention to detail that characterized his metalworking. Each technique had to be described clearly enough for a novice to follow, yet thoroughly enough to convey the subtleties that made the difference between adequate and exceptional work. The organization of the material reflected a master teacher's understanding of how skills were best learned, beginning with basic techniques and gradually building toward more complex projects. The tools Theophilus used were similar in principle to those of any metalworker, but often superior in quality and specialized for particular tasks. The monastery's resources allowed for the creation and maintenance of precision instruments that a village smith could not afford. His hammers were carefully shaped for specific purposes, some heavy for initial shaping, others light for delicate finishing work. Each had its own balance and feel, developed through years of use until it became an extension of his own hand. His tongs were designed for particular types of work, some for holding small pieces during delicate operations, others for manipulating large sheets of metal during major projects. The files and gravers he used for finishing work were kept sharp and true through constant maintenance, their cutting edges honed to perfection, yet even the finest tools could not eliminate the fundamental challenges of working with fire and metal, the burns, the fatigue, the constant vigilance required to produce acceptable results. The anvil itself was perhaps the most important tool in the workshop, its surface providing the solid foundation upon which all shaping operations depended. A good anvil was a substantial investment, often passed down through generations of craftsmen. Theophilus's anvil would have been carefully maintained, its surface kept smooth and true through regular attention. Nicks and imperfections had to be filed away immediately, lest they transfer to the work and ruin delicate projects. The relationship between craftsmen and tools was intimate and personal. Each hammer had its own feel, each tong its own grip. Theophilus would have known instinctively which tool was right for each operation, reaching for the correct implement without conscious thought. This unconscious competence was the mark of true mastery, achieved only through years of practice and attention. The tools became extensions of intention, channels through which skill and creativity flowed into the work. The materials Theophilus worked with came from across the known world, arriving at the monastery through trade networks that connected distant regions of Europe and beyond. Iron came from local mines or was traded from regions known for high quality, or copper arrived from mines in Central Europe, carefully transported to avoid contamination that might affect its working properties. Tin, essential for bronze making, traveled even greater distances, often originating in Cornwall and passing through multiple trading centers before reaching its final destination. Precious metals presented their own challenges and opportunities. Gold and silver were often donated to the monastery in raw form, requiring careful assaying to determine purity and appropriate treatment. These materials came with their own histories, family heirlooms melted down for pious purposes, coins and jewelry contributed by wealthy patrons seeking spiritual benefits. Each piece of precious metal carried not just material value but emotional and spiritual significance that added weight to the craftsman's responsibility. The chemistry of metalworking was still largely mysterious in Theophilus's time. Yet practical experience had taught craftsmen which combinations produced desired results. The knowledge was empirical rather than theoretical, passed down through generations of practice rather than scholarly study. Theophilus understood that certain proportions of copper and tin produced bronze with particular qualities. The adding lead made pewter easier to work. The different types of iron required different approaches to achieve optimal results. As we drift toward the end of our time with Theophilus, picture him in his final years, still working at the forge despite the accumulated wear on his body. His hands, gnarled and scarred from decades of work, still possessed the skill and sensitivity needed for delicate operations. His eyes, strained by years of working in poor light, could still judge the subtle color changes that indicated proper working temperature. His back, bent from countless hours over the anvil, still possessed the strength needed for major projects. The wisdom he had accumulated was irreplaceable. Not just technical knowledge about temperatures and techniques, but the deeper understanding that came from a lifetime spent in dialogue with fire and metal. He knew by instinct when iron was ready to work, could tell by the sound of his hammer whether the metal was responding properly to his efforts. This knowledge was impossible to capture fully in words, yet he tried nonetheless, hoping that future craftsmen might benefit from his experience. His manuscript was written as much for himself as for future craftsmen, a way of organizing and preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost. In setting down his instructions for creating bells and chalices, for mixing alloys and managing fires, he was creating a form of immortality, ensuring that something of his life's work would survive the inevitable decay of flesh and bone. The act of writing became itself a form of craft, requiring the same patience and attention to detail that characterized his metalworking. The monastery where he worked may have crumbled, its stones scattered or repurposed for other buildings. The bells he cast may have fallen silent, their bronze melted down for cannon during some long-forgotten war. The chalices he created with such care may have been lost or destroyed in the countless upheavals that marked the passage of centuries. But his words remain, carrying across the centuries the voice of a craftsman who understood both the burden and the dignity of working with fire and iron in service of something greater than himself. In the flickering light of forge and candle, Theophilus wrote his final instructions, his final warnings about the patience required for true craftsmanship. Let no one, he counseled, think that he can quickly attain to the excellence of this art. The excellence he spoke of was not just technical mastery, but the deeper understanding that comes only through long apprenticeship to fire and metal, through years of small failures and incremental successes, through the gradual transformation of raw human hands into instruments capable of creating beauty from base materials. His legacy lives on not just in the techniques he preserved, but in the understanding he conveyed of craft as a form of devotion, work as a path to transcendence. In an age when the distinction between sacred and secular had different meanings than it does today, Theophilus demonstrated that skilled labor performed with attention and reverence could itself become a form of prayer, a way of participating in the divine act of creation. His life reminds us that the highest expressions of human craft have always been motivated by purposes larger than mere utility or profit, by the desire to create something beautiful, something lasting, something worthy of the gifts we have been given. Let us now drift from the documented life of Theophilus into the realm of mystery and interpretation, where archaeologists puzzle over tiny marks etched into medieval metal, and historians debate the meaning of symbols that were carved by hands 800 years in their graves. Imagine yourself as an archaeologist, carefully brushing soil from a medieval horseshoe discovered in what was once a village blacksmith's workshop. The iron is dark with age and pitted with rust, but as you clean it, something catches your eye. A small mark near one of the nail holes, so faint you almost miss it. It's a simple star, barely an inch across, carved into the metal with deliberate care. This is not an accident of corrosion or a random scratch from use. Someone centuries ago took the time to etch this symbol into their work, adding to the labor of creation an extra moment of intention, of meaning, of perhaps hope, or protection, or simple pride. But what did it mean? Why was it placed there? What can it tell us about the inner life of the craftsman who made it? The discovery of such marks is always a moment of profound connection across time. And this simple horseshoe is evidence of a human consciousness that existed centuries ago. Someone who thought beyond mere function to invest their work with personal meaning. The star might have been a protective symbol, a signature of sorts, or perhaps just an expression of aesthetic sensibility. Whatever its purpose, it represents a deliberate act of marking, of claiming ownership, not just of the object, but of the moment of its creation. Across Europe, scattered through museums and private collections, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of medieval tools, weapons, and household items bearing similar marks. Some are simple lines, crosses, initials, geometric patterns that might be completed in a few quick strokes. Others are more elaborate heraldic symbols requiring careful planning. Religious icons demanding precise execution, complex interwoven designs that speak of considerable artistic skill and extended effort. They appear on swords and plowshares, on horseshoes and cooking pots, on bells and buckles and the humble nails that held medieval life together. The sheer variety of marked objects suggests that the practice cut across all levels of medieval society. High-status items like ceremonial weapons and liturgical vessels might bear elaborate markings befitting their importance. But even the most mundane objects, kitchen knives, farm tools, household hardware, sometimes carry the same careful attention to symbolic detail. This democratization of marking suggests that the impulse to sign one's work, to invest it with meaning beyond its immediate function, was a fundamental aspect of medieval craftsmanship. The marks fall into several categories, each suggesting different purposes and meanings. Some appear to be guild marks, symbols that identify the craftsman or workshop responsible for a particular piece. Medieval guilds were powerful organizations that controlled trade and maintained quality standards, and marking one's work was both a form of advertisement and a guarantee of workmanship. A smith whose mark was associated with superior tools might command higher prices and attract customers from neighboring villages, building a reputation that could sustain a workshop through generations. These guild marks often incorporated elements of heraldry, borrowing from the visual language of nobility to create distinctive symbols that could be recognized even by illiterate customers. A hammer and anvil might identify a general blacksmith, while more specialized symbols might indicate particular types of work or specific master craftsmen. Over time, these marks could become valuable intellectual property, passed down through families or sold along with workshop equipment when businesses changed hands. But many marks seem to serve purposes beyond mere identification. Religious symbols are extraordinarily common, crosses in various forms, fish representing early Christian identity, stars that might represent the Star of Bethlehem, or invoke other biblical imagery. In an age when faith permeated every aspect of daily life, it's not surprising that craftsmen would invoke divine protection for their work. A plowshare marked with a cross might be believed to bring God's blessing to the fields it worked, ensuring good harvests and protection from natural disasters. A sword bearing a religious symbol might be thought to protect its wielder in battle, turning aside enemy blades or granting strength in the moment of combat. The theological implications of this practice were complex and sometimes controversial. While the Church officially discouraged superstitious beliefs, it also recognized the deep human need for tangible symbols of divine protection. Some marks clearly represent Orthodox Christian symbolism, while others hint at older pre-Christian beliefs that persisted beneath the surface of medieval society. The tension between official doctrine and popular practice created a gray area where craftsmen could express spiritual beliefs that might not align perfectly with church teaching. Some marks appear to be apotropaic, designed to ward off evil or bad luck. Medieval belief systems included a complex understanding of supernatural forces that could interfere with human endeavors. Iron itself was believed to have protective properties, able to repel demons and malevolent spirits that might otherwise cause tools to break, weapons to fail, or work to go wrong. A horseshoe was already considered lucky. One marked with protective symbols might be doubly so. The act of marking might have been seen as enhancing the natural protective qualities of the iron. It's creating a talisman that would serve its owner in ways beyond its basic function. These protective marks often drew from a rich tradition of folk magic that existed alongside Christian belief. Symbols derived from ancient runic alphabets, geometric patterns believed to confuse evil spirits, stylized animal figures thought to embody protective qualities. All of these might appear on ostensibly Christian objects, creating a syncretic blend of beliefs that reflected the complex spiritual landscape of medieval Europe. The process of creating these marks would have required additional time and effort that busy craftsmen could ill afford. After completing the functional aspects of an item, shaping it, strengthening it, finishing it to the required standard, the smith would have had to take up smaller tools, perhaps a sharp awl or a small chisel, and carefully etch the chosen symbol. This was delicate work, requiring steady hands and good light, and any mistake might ruin hours of labor or damage an expensive piece of work. The tools for marking were often specialized instruments, separate from the heavy hammers and tongs used for shaping. A marking awl might be ground to a specific angle and sharpened to a precise point that could create clean lines without excessive force. Chisels for marking work were smaller and finer than those used for cutting, designed to remove tiny amounts of metal with each blow. Some craftsmen might have developed their own marking tools, creating instruments perfectly suited to their particular style and preferred symbols. Yet they did it anyway. Something about these small marks was important enough to justify the extra effort. The risk of mistakes, the investment of time that could otherwise be spent on productive work. Perhaps it was professional pride, the desire to sign one's work, to claim credit for particularly fine craftsmanship in an era when individual achievement was often subsumed into collective identity. Perhaps it was spiritual belief, the conviction that proper symbols could invoke divine favor or protection, ensuring that the object would serve its intended purpose and protect its user from harm. Perhaps it was simply human nature, the irrepressible urge to leave some trace of individual identity, some small rebellion against the anonymity that claimed most medieval lives. The psychological dimensions of marking are particularly fascinating when considered against the backdrop of medieval social structure. Most craftsmen lived lives of relative obscurity, their names unrecorded in any official documents, their personal stories lost to history. Yet in these small marks they asserted their individual presence, claiming a tiny space for personal expression within the constraints of their social position. Each symbol became a form of signature, a way of saying, "I made this," that would persist long after the maker's name was forgotten. Archaeological evidence suggests that the practice of marking metalwork was widespread, but not universal. Some regions show a high percentage of marked items, while others show very few. Some craftsmen seem to have marked everything they made, creating consistent personal brands that might have helped establish their reputations. Others marked only special pieces or important commissions, reserving the extra effort for work that held particular significance. The variation suggests that the practice was a matter of personal choice rather than guild requirement or universal custom. Reflecting individual decisions about how to invest time and meaning in one's work, regional variations in marking practices reveal fascinating insights into local cultures and beliefs. Northern European smiths often incorporated runic symbols, tapping into pre-Christian traditions that associated written characters with magical power. These marks might serve dual purposes, identifying the maker while also invoking ancient protective forces that predated Christian influence. Germanic craftsmen favored geometric patterns and stylized animals, often drawing from heraldic traditions that emphasized family identity and tribal affiliation. The symbols themselves show fascinating regional variations that mirror broader cultural patterns. Scandinavian smiths often used runic characters, tapping into pre-Christian traditions that associated written symbols with magical power. These runic marks might serve multiple purposes simultaneously, identifying the craftsman, invoking protective spirits, and demonstrating literacy in an age when writing was a specialized skill. The persistence of runic symbolism well into the Christian period suggests that older traditions maintained their power even as official religious practices changed. Germanic craftsmen favored geometric patterns and stylized animals that often reflected heraldic influences. These marks might incorporate elements from family crests or regional symbols, creating connections between individual craftsmanship and larger social identities. A wolf might represent strength and cunning. A tree might symbolize growth and stability. A geometric pattern might express mathematical concepts or aesthetic preferences that reflected the maker's education and cultural background. In regions with strong Christian influence, religious symbols predominated. But even these showed remarkable variety and creativity. Simple crosses might be elaborated with decorative elements, Fish symbols might be combined with other Christian imagery. Stars might be arranged in patterns that suggested specific biblical references or theological concepts. The creativity evident in these religious marks suggests that craftsmen saw themselves as active participants in expressing their faith, rather than passive recipients of church doctrine. Trade routes seem to have carried symbolic traditions along with goods, creating hybrid forms where local and foreign influences merged in unexpected ways. A sword made in England might bear Scandinavian runic marks, if its maker had learned techniques from traveling craftsmen. A horseshoe forged in France might incorporate Germanic geometric patterns if its creator had been exposed to foreign traditions through trade connections. These cultural crossings created rich symbolic vocabularies that reflected the interconnected nature of medieval European society. Some of the most intriguing marks are those that resist easy interpretation, symbols that seem to exist at the boundaries of known iconographic traditions. Complex geometric patterns that might represent mathematical concepts, astronomical observations, or purely aesthetic preferences challenge our understanding of medieval craftsmanship and the intellectual sophistication of working artisans. Animal figures that could be heraldic symbols, religious references, or personal totems suggest meaning systems that operated beyond official cultural categories. Consider, for example, patterns of interconnected circles and lines that appear on various medieval tools and weapons. These might represent celestial relationships, with circles as planets or stars and lines, showing their connections in medieval astronomical understanding. Alternatively, they might be purely decorative, expressions of the maker's sense of proportion and design. Or they might be protective charms, geometric forms believed to capture and redirect harmful influences. The ambiguity is part of their fascination, reminding us that medieval symbolic systems were often more complex and sophisticated than we might assume. Combinations of letters that might be initials, abbreviations, or magical formulae present their own interpretive challenges. What appears to be a simple monogram might actually be a compressed prayer, a magical formula, or a coded reference to guild secrets. Medieval literacy operated on multiple levels, and the same letters might carry different meanings for different audiences. A mark that appeared to be purely decorative to an illiterate customer might convey specific information to other craftsmen, or hold religious significance for the maker. Each mark is a puzzle, a glimpse into a mind that has been silent for centuries, a fragment of individual consciousness preserved in iron and bronze and precious metals. They remind us that even the most functional objects were created by people with inner lives, with beliefs and fears and hopes that they expressed through their work. The marks become a form of medieval graffiti, personal statements etched into the material culture of their time. Consider a particular example, discovered in the ruins of a medieval castle in England, a sword blade bearing an intricate pattern of interconnected circles and lines. The pattern is precisely executed, suggesting considerable skill and planning. The circles are perfectly round, the lines straight and evenly spaced, indicating that the craftsman used some form of measuring device or template to ensure accuracy. But what does it mean? The circles might represent celestial bodies, the lines showing their relationships according to medieval astronomical understanding, or the pattern might be purely decorative, an expression of the smith's aesthetic sense and mathematical sophistication. Or it might be a protective charm, a geometric form designed to ensure the weapon's effectiveness in battle by capturing and focusing beneficial forces. The ambiguity is part of the fascination. These marks exist at the intersection of craft and belief, of practical necessity and spiritual hope. They suggest that medieval craftsmen saw their work as more than mere economic activity, more than simple transformation of raw materials into useful objects. The act of creation was imbued with meaning, with the possibility of blessing or curse, with the opportunity to leave something of oneself embedded in the iron that would persist long after the maker's death. The spiritual dimensions of marking practices reveal much about medieval understanding of the relationship between material and spiritual worlds. In a universe where divine and demonic forces were understood to be constantly active in human affairs, the creation of any object was potentially a spiritual act. The choice of symbols might determine whether a tool would serve its owner well or bring misfortune, whether a weapon would protect its wielder or fail in the crucial moment of combat. This spiritual understanding of craftsmanship extended beyond simple superstition to encompass Sophisticated theological concepts about the nature of creation and human participation in divine activity. Just as God had created the world through divine word and will, human craftsmen participated in ongoing creation through their skill and intention. Marks they added to their work became forms of prayer, expressions of hope that their creations would serve good purposes and reflect divine order rather than chaos. The tools used to create these marks would have been simple. Sharp-pointed instruments that could scratch or gouge lines in metal with precision and control. Some marks show evidence of careful planning, with guidelines lightly scratched before the final symbol was carved, indicating that the craftsman had thought through the design and layout before committing to the final version. Others appear more spontaneous, as if the craftsman was seized by sudden inspiration and acted on impulse, adding a quick symbol that felt right in the moment of creation. The quality varies dramatically, from crude scratches that barely disturb the surface to deeply incised symbols that show considerable artistic skill and technical sophistication. Some marks are clearly the work of master craftsmen, executed with the same precision and attention to detail that characterize their primary work. Others suggest apprentices or less skilled workers, people who understood the importance of marking but lacked the technical ability to execute complex designs. This variation in quality raises interesting questions about the transmission of marking traditions. Were specific symbols and techniques passed down through formal apprenticeship, or did craftsmen develop their own approaches through trial and error? The existence of similar symbols across wide geographic areas suggests some form of systematic transmission, possibly through guild networks or traveling craftsmen who carried techniques and meanings from workshop to workshop. Timing was crucial in the marking process. The marks had to be made when the metal was at the right temperature, soft enough to accept the engraving tool without excessive force, but cool enough that the tool wouldn't damage or distort from the heat. This narrow window of opportunity meant that the decision to mark a piece had to be made in advance, and the symbol had to be executed quickly and confidently. There was no room for hesitation or correction once the marking process began. The temperature requirements for marking also meant that the process had to be integrated into the overall workflow of creation. A smith couldn't simply decide to add a mark as an afterthought. The marking had to be planned from the beginning and executed at the proper moment in the cooling process. This integration suggests that marked pieces were special in some way, worthy of the extra planning and effort required to execute the marking successfully. Some marks appear to have been added after the initial completion of the item, during later repair or modification. A sword blade might receive additional symbols when it changed hands, reflecting new ownership or commemorating significant events in its history. A horseshoe might be marked when it was fitted to a particularly valuable horse, acknowledging the importance of both animal and owner. These later additions suggest that the practice of marking remained meaningful throughout the useful life of an object, that symbols could be added or modified as circumstances changed. The phenomenon of later marking raises questions about the ongoing relationship between objects and their symbolic meanings. Did a sword accumulate spiritual power through its markings, becoming more effective as more symbols were added? Did ownership marks serve practical purposes in societies where personal property might be disputed? The layering of symbols over time suggests that medieval people understood objects as having continuing lives and changing meanings rather than fixed identities established at the moment of creation. The mystery deepens when we consider marks that appear to be deliberately obscured or altered. Some symbols show evidence of being partially filed away, as if someone wanted to remove or modify them without completely destroying the underlying metalwork. Others are overmarked with different symbols, creating layered meanings that may reflect changing ownership, beliefs, or circumstances. What prompted these modifications? Did the original mark become unlucky or inappropriate? Did new owners want to impose their own symbols while respecting the work of previous craftsmen? These alterations and obliterations provide glimpses into the complex social lives of medieval objects. A weapon that changed hands through conquest might have its original marks modified to reflect new loyalties. A tool that failed to serve its intended purpose might have protective symbols added or changed in an attempt to improve its performance. The evidence of deliberate modification suggests that medieval people understood symbols as having real power that could be changed or redirected through physical alteration. The geographic distribution of marked items reveals interesting patterns that reflect broader aspects of medieval society and economy. Urban workshops seem to have produced a higher percentage of marked pieces than rural smiths, perhaps reflecting the greater competition and need for identification in crowded markets where customers had many choices. In cities, a distinctive mark might be the difference between success and failure, providing brand recognition that could sustain a business through changing economic conditions. Royal or noble commissions show elaborate marking more frequently than everyday items, suggesting that status and display played important roles in the decision to mark. High-status objects were meant to be seen and admired. An elaborate symbolic decoration served both aesthetic and social functions. A ceremonial sword with intricate markings demonstrated not only the wealth of its owner, but also the skill of its maker, creating value that extended beyond mere function. Religious sites have yielded particularly rich collections of marked metalwork, reflecting both the spiritual significance of marking practices and the institutional wealth that allowed for elaborate symbolic decoration. Monastery workshops like that of Theophilus produced items with complex religious symbolism that drew from sophisticated theological understanding. These marks weren't simply protective charms, but carefully planned expressions of doctrinal concepts and spiritual aspirations. Pilgrim badges, small metal tokens sold at religious shrines, often bear intricate marks that identified both the shrine and the craftsman, creating a complex system of religious and commercial identification. These items were mass-produced, but still showed individual variations in marking, suggesting that even routine commercial production allowed for personal expression. The badges served as proof of pilgrimage completion, while also functioning as protective amulets, combining practical and spiritual purposes in ways that characterized much of medieval material culture. The decline of the marking tradition seems to have coincided with changes in medieval society and technology that reduced both the practical necessity and spiritual significance of individual marking. As guilds became more formalized and regulatory, standardized makers' marks became more common, displacing the earlier tradition of personal or symbolic marking. Official guild marks served legal and commercial purposes, but often lacked the spiritual or personal dimensions of earlier traditions. The rise of larger workshops and more industrial production methods made individual marking less practical and economically viable. When production shifted from individual craftsmen creating single pieces to teams of workers collaborating on multiple items, the intimate relationship between maker and object that had supported marking traditions began to break down. Mass production required standardization and efficiency that left little room for personal expression or symbolic elaboration. The gradual shift away from supernatural explanations for everyday events may have reduced the perceived need for protective symbols and spiritual markings. As mechanical understanding of tools and weapons improved, the idea that symbolic markings could affect performance began to seem less credible. The rise of more systematic approaches to metallurgy and engineering provided alternative explanations for success and failure that didn't require supernatural intervention. Yet the practice never disappeared entirely, persisting in various forms through changing historical circumstances. Even today, craftsmen working in traditional methods often mark their work, continuing a tradition that stretches back through the centuries. Modern blacksmiths, following ancient techniques, understand the impulse that drove their medieval predecessors to add these small signs of identity and intention to their creations. Contemporary makers working in metal often incorporate personal symbols or signatures that serve similar functions to medieval marks, claiming ownership and expressing individual identity through their work. The persistence of marking traditions in contemporary craft suggests that the underlying human needs served by these practices remain constant across historical periods. The desire to sign one's work, to invest it with personal meaning, to connect individual identity with creative output appears to be a fundamental aspect of human nature that transcends specific cultural or technological contexts. The marks remain scattered through museums and archaeological collections, each one a tiny window into a vanished world. They speak of beliefs we can only partially understand, of fears and hopes that shape daily life in ways we can barely imagine. They remind us that the anonymous craftsmen who forged our ancestors' tools were not merely laborers following routine procedures, but individuals with their own understanding of meaning and purpose, people who found ways to express their humanity through their work. Modern archaeological techniques continue to reveal new aspects of medieval marking practices, Advanced imaging technologies can detect marks that are invisible to the naked eye, revealing symbols that have been worn away by use or deliberately obscured. Chemical analysis can determine the sequence in which marks were made, providing insights into the evolution of symbolic practices over time. Digital databases allow researchers to compare marks from different regions and periods, identifying patterns that might not be apparent from individual discoveries. These technological advances are transforming our understanding of medieval craftsmanship and the role of symbolic marking in medieval society. What once seemed like isolated curiosities are now recognized as part of systematic traditions that connected individual craftsmen to larger networks of meaning and identity. The marks are beginning to tell coherent stories about medieval life, belief, and cultural transmission that complement and enrich the documentary evidence preserved in written sources. In the end, perhaps the specific meaning of each mark matters less than what the practice reveals about the human need to invest work with significance, to leave traces of individual presence in a world that tends toward anonymity. Each small star or cross or geometric pattern represents a moment when a craftsman paused in their labor to add something that went beyond mere function. A prayer, a signature, a hope for blessing or protection, an assertion of individual identity in a world that often reduced people to their social roles. The marking traditions of medieval craftsmen remind us that the boundary between art and craft, between functional and decorative, between sacred and secular, was far more fluid in medieval society than we might assume. Every object was potentially a canvas for personal expression. Every act of creation an opportunity to participate in larger systems of meaning and belief. The marks they left behind continue to speak across the centuries, offering glimpses into inner lives that were otherwise hidden from historical record. As we drift away from these ancient mysteries, let the image linger. Countless craftsmen, working by firelight and daylight, taking a moment to etch their small marks into the iron they shaped. The marks they made have outlasted their names, their faces, their individual stories. But in those tiny scratches and symbols, something of their humanity persists, speaking across the centuries in a language of metal and meaning that we are still learning to understand. Each mark represents a moment of connection between past and present. A reminder that the objects we handled daily were once touched by human hands that hoped, feared, believed, and dreamed, much as we do today. As our journey through the world of medieval metalworking draws toward its gentle close, let us turn our attention to the stark contrasts that define the age. The gulf between those who wielded the finished steel and those whose hands had shaped it from raw iron. Between the glory of knighthood and the anonymity of craft. Picture, if you will, a great castle rising from its hill like a stone mountain, its walls glowing warm in the afternoon sun. From the village below, you can hear the faint sounds of celebration. Laughter, music, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, as nobles arrive for some grand occasion. Perhaps it's a wedding, or the celebration of a military victory, or simply one of those lavish feasts that punctuated the calendar of medieval nobility. But we are not ascending to the great hall, where silk banners hang from the rafters, and where minstrels sing of heroic deeds. Instead, we drift toward a different part of the castle complex. The workshops and service areas where the real business of maintaining noble power takes place. Here, in a forge larger and better equipped than any village smithy, a different kind of metalworker plies his trade. The castle smith holds a position of considerable importance within the feudal hierarchy. His skills are essential to the military power that underlies all noble authority. Without him, there would be no swords for the knights, no spear points for the men-at-arms, no horseshoes for the destriers that carry armored warriors into battle. Yet for all his importance, he remains fundamentally a servant, bound to his lord's will and dependent on his lord's favor. The castle forged itself reflects this paradox of importance and subservience. It's well supplied with the finest materials, high-quality iron imported from regions known for superior or charcoal. Made from specific types of wood that burn hot and clean, exotic alloys and precious metals for decorative work. The tools are superior to anything a village smith could afford. Hammers of perfect balance, tongs precisely fitted for different tasks, files and grinding stones imported from distant lands. Yet the smith who works here enjoys none of the independence that comes with owning one's own workshop. Every piece of iron belongs to the Lord. Every hour of labor serves the Lord's purposes. Every finished product adds to the lord's power and prestige. The castle smith may be better fed and better housed than his village counterpart, but he is also more completely owned. Consider the creation of a knight's sword, perhaps the most prestigious work the castle smith will ever undertake. The weapon begins as carefully selected bars of iron and steel, materials that represent considerable wealth and careful planning. The smith must forge weld these different grades of metal together, creating a blade that combines the hardness needed for a sharp edge with the flexibility needed to withstand the shock of combat. This process requires days or even weeks of careful work. The blade must be shaped gradually, heated and reheated countless times, hammered into form with precise attention to balance and proportion. The junction between different grades of steel must be perfect. Any weakness in the welding will create a fault line where the blade might break in battle. The smith works with the knowledge that a knight's life may depend on the perfection of his craft. As the blade takes shape, it acquires its own beauty. The subtle patterns created by the welding process, the gentle curve that gives the weapon its distinctive profile, the gradual taper from base to point that ensures proper balance. This is art as much as craft, requiring not just technical skill, but aesthetic sensibility. The castle smith must understand not only metallurgy, but also the visual language of power and status that the weapon will communicate. The tempering of the blade is perhaps the most critical moment in the entire process. The steel must be heated to exactly the right temperature and then cooled at precisely the correct rate to achieve the proper hardness. Too soft and the edge will not hold. Too hard and the blade will be brittle and prone to breaking. The smith has only one chance to get this right. There is no undoing a failed temper. In the final stages, the blade receives its finish. Careful polishing that reveals the patterns in the steel, perhaps decorative etching or inlay work that proclaims the owner's identity and status. The crossguard and pommel are fitted, often incorporating precious metals or gems that transform the weapon from mere tool to symbol of authority. When complete, the sword represents hundreds of hours of skilled labor, materials worth a fortune, and knowledge accumulated over generations. Yet when the knight receives his finished weapon, the smith who created it fades into invisibility. The sword becomes part of the knight's identity, an extension of his person that he will name and treasure and perhaps pass down to his heirs. Its beauty and effectiveness reflect on its wielder's status and power. The name of the smith who forged it is forgotten almost immediately. His contribution acknowledged only in the abstract obligation that exists between lord and servant. This dynamic plays out across every aspect of castle life. The armor that protects the knight in battle, perhaps 50 pounds of carefully shaped steel plates, each one fitted to his specific measurements. Each joint articulated to allow freedom of movement while providing maximum protection represents months of painstaking work by the castle armorer. Yet the knight who wears it into battle receives all the glory, while the craftsman who made his survival possible remains anonymous. The contrast becomes even more stark when we consider the social rituals that surround knightly culture. It's the tournament, that elaborate pageant of martial skill and social display, showcases the finished products of metalworking craft, while completely obscuring the labor that created them. Knights thunder across the field in gleaming armor, wielding weapons that catch the sunlight like liquid metal, their horses protected by steel barding that moves like silver scales. The spectators see only the romance and glory, the bright banners, the elaborate heraldry, the thunder of hooves and clash of weapons. They see prowess and valor and noble bearing. What they don't see are the weeks of preparation that made the spectacle possible. The repairs to damaged armor, it's the sharpening of dulled weapons, it's the careful fitting and adjustment of equipment to ensure that nothing will fail at a critical moment. Behind every glittering knight stands an invisible craftsman whose work made the display possible. The sword that performs so beautifully in the lists was shaped by hands that will never hold a weapon in anger. The armor that turns aside the fiercest blows was hammered out by a man who will never feel the exhilaration of mounted combat. The glory belongs entirely to the warrior. The labor that made the glory possible is forgotten. Even in times of peace, the contrast between noble and craftsman remains stark. The castle hall where the lord holds court is filled with evidence of metalworking skill. Wrought iron hinges on massive doors, Decorative grillwork over windows, elaborate candelabra that hold dozens of candles, the very nails and brackets that hold the tapestries and banners that proclaim the family's greatness. The Lord dines on food prepared with iron implements, served on silver plates that bear his coat of arms, cut with knives whose blades hold edges sharp enough to slice through the finest meats. His comfort depends on countless metal objects, locks for his treasure chests, keys for his private chambers, buckles and clasps for his clothing, spurs for his riding boots. Every aspect of his privileged life is supported by metalwork, yet the men who create these necessities remain as invisible as the servants who prepare his food or clean his chambers. The economic relationship between lord and smith reveals another dimension of this inequality. The castle smith receives his sustenance not as payment for completed work, but as a form of feudal obligation. He is fed and housed and clothed, but he owns nothing. The workshop where he labors belongs to the Lord. The tools he uses belong to the Lord. Even the skills he has developed are considered the Lord's property. Should he displease his master, or should his services no longer be needed, he can be dismissed with nothing but the clothes on his back. This dependence extends beyond the individual craftsman to his entire family. His children grow up in the shadow of the castle, their futures determined by their father's position in the feudal hierarchy. A son might follow his father into metalworking, but only if the Lord has need of additional smiths. A daughter might marry another castle servant, but only with the Lord's permission. Their lives are shaped entirely by forces beyond their control. Yet the irony of the situation is that the Lord's power ultimately depends on these supposedly inferior craftsmen. Without the castle smith, there would be no weapons for his knights, no armor for his men-at-arms, no iron tools for his fields. The entire structure of feudal authority rests on a foundation of skilled labor that the system simultaneously requires and devalues. This paradox becomes most apparent during times of conflict. When war comes, the castle smith suddenly finds himself in desperate demand. Weapons need constant repair. Armor requires adjustment and replacement. The tools of war consume iron at an unprecedented rate. The pace of work becomes frantic, with the smith laboring by candlelight through the night to meet urgent needs. During a siege, the smith's workshop becomes perhaps the most critical part of the castle's defenses. Crossbow bolts must be manufactured by the hundreds. Siege engines require iron reinforcement. The weapons of defenders need constant maintenance. The survival of everyone in the castle, including the Lord himself, may depend on the smith's ability to keep the tools of war in working order. Yet even in these moments of obvious dependence, the social hierarchy remains unchanged. The smith works himself to exhaustion in service of his lord's survival, but he receives no share of the glory. When the siege is lifted or the battle won, the lord who successfully defended his castle will be celebrated and remembered. The craftsman whose work made the defense possible will be forgotten. The disparity extends even to basic comfort and safety. The Lord's chambers are spacious and well appointed, heated by great fireplaces furnished with the finest goods that money can buy. The smith's quarters are small and Spartan, barely adequate shelter from the elements. The Lord dines on fresh bread, roasted meats, imported wines. The smith eats porridge, root vegetables, small beer. The Lord sleeps on a feather mattress under silk covers. The smith makes do with straw and rough wool. When illness comes, the Lord has access to the best medical care available. Physicians trained in the universities, expensive medicines imported from distant lands, the constant attention of skilled attendants. The smith, if he falls ill, must rely on folk remedies and hope that his constitution will see him through. If his illness prevents him from working, his position in the castle may become precarious. The clothing worn by lord and smith tells its own story of inequality. The lord's garments are made from fine fabrics, silk, velvet, fur, and decorated with gold thread, precious stones. Elaborate embroidery that proclaims his wealth and status. The smith wears simple, practical clothing designed to withstand the harsh conditions of his work. Heavy leather aprons to protect against sparks, coarse wool that can be replaced when it becomes too damaged to wear. Even in death, the contrast persists. When a lord dies, his passing is marked by elaborate ceremony. Funeral masses, processions, elaborate tombs that ensure his memory will be preserved. The sword he carried and the armor he wore may be buried with him or preserved as relics of his greatness. When a smith dies, he is buried in simple ceremony with minimal marking. His tools passed to his successor, his contribution to the castle's strength forgotten almost immediately. Yet for all the inequality and exploitation inherent in the system, there remains something profound about the relationship between the creator and the user of these metal objects. The knight who charges into battle carries not just a weapon, but a piece of the smith's soul. The countless hours of careful work, the knowledge passed down through generations, the quiet pride that comes from perfect craftsmanship. In this sense, the smith achieves a form of immortality that the knight, for all his glory, might envy. The sword outlasts the hand that wielded it. The armor survives the body it protected. Long after the knight's name is forgotten, the work of the smith's hands continues to exist, bearing silent witness to skills that transformed raw iron into objects of beauty and power. As we drift toward the end of our exploration, consider this: the greatest achievements of medieval civilization, the cathedrals that still inspire, the castles that still command respect, the illuminated manuscripts that still capture our imagination, all depended on the quiet labor of anonymous craftsmen. The smith who forged the nails that held the roof beams, the tools that carved the stone, the hinges that hung the doors, contributed as much to these monuments as the architects whose names we remember. In the gentle hierarchy of sleep, where dreams level all distinctions and rest comes equally to lord and servant, perhaps we can find a truer perspective on these ancient inequalities. The ache in the smith's shoulders and the weight of the knight's armor both dissolve in slumber. The gleam of polished steel and the glow of forge fire both fade into the soft darkness that claims all human endeavor. The hammer falls silent, the anvil grows cold, and in the quiet that follows we might hear something more important than the clang of metal on metal, the steady heartbeat of human effort, the rhythm of creativity and toil that built our world, one careful blow at a time. As our journey through the smoky workshops and candlelit forges of the medieval world draws to its gentle close, let us take a moment to reflect on how far we have traveled, not just through the halls of history, but through the understanding of what it means to create, to toil, to leave something of lasting value in a world that seems determined toward impermanence. The blacksmiths we have visited tonight, the village craftsman with his aching shoulders and smoke-stained hands, the monk Theophilus with his sacred devotion to both God and iron, the anonymous castle smith whose work armed knights and defended kingdoms, all share a common thread that stretches across the centuries to touch our own lives. In their daily struggle with fire and metal, they remind us of something we have perhaps forgotten in our age of mass production and digital convenience, that every useful object was once shaped by human hands, that every tool that serves us carries within it the knowledge and effort of its maker, that the civilization we inhabit was built not by grand gestures, but by countless small acts of skilled labor. The rhythm of their days rising before dawn, coaxing fire from cold ashes, bending stubborn iron to useful shapes, echoes still in the work of craftsmen around the world. Though the technology has changed, though we now have electric forges and pneumatic hammers, the fundamental relationship between creator and material remains the same. Iron still resists, fire still burns, and human hands still must guide the transformation from raw metal to finished tool. The marks they carved into their work, those mysterious symbols we explored in our journey, speak to something deeper than mere identification or superstition. They represent the human need to leave traces of individual presence in collective endeavor. To sign one's name, however small, in the great book of making that defines our species. In our own time, when so much of what we use bears no trace of its maker's identity, perhaps we can appreciate more deeply the impulse that drove those medieval craftsmen to etch their small stars and crosses into cooling iron. The social contrasts we witnessed between the lord in his finery and the smith in his leather apron remind us that inequality is not new, that the tension between those who labor and those who benefit from that labor has ancient roots. Yet they also show us something hopeful, that skilled work has always commanded a measure of respect, that craftsmanship creates value that transcends social boundaries, that the things we make with care and knowledge have power to outlast the systems that gave them birth. As you settle deeper into sleep, let yourself imagine the workshop growing quiet, the forge fire, so bright and demanding during the working day, banks down to glowing coals. The hammers rest silent on their benches. The anvil, that patient partner in so many hours of creative struggle, stands ready for tomorrow's labor. The acrid smell of smoke begins to fade, replaced by the cooler, cleaner air of evening. Outside, the village settles into its own quiet rhythm. Candles are extinguished one by one. Families gather for simple meals. Children are tucked into beds of straw and wool. The bells that our monastery smith cast ring the evening hours, their bronze voices carrying across fields and forests, marking time for communities that exist now only in memory and imagination. The contrast between the harsh labor of the day and the peace of evening mirrors our own journey from the busy concerns of modern life into the gentler realm of sleep. Just as the blacksmith could lay down his hammer and let his aching muscles rest, so we can let go of the day's tensions and allow our minds to drift into quieter waters. Think of the horseshoes that once protected the hooves of horses now 8 centuries in their graves. The plowshares that turned soil that has been tilled by machines for generations. The nails that held together buildings that have long since returned to earth. These objects served their purpose and passed away, as all things must, but the hands that made them participated in something larger. The great human project of making useful beauty from raw materials. The village blacksmith we visited at the beginning of our journey has laid down his tools for the last time. His workshop has fallen into ruin. His very name has been forgotten. Yet something of what he accomplished persists, not just in the specific objects he created, but in the tradition of making that pass through his hands to reach us across the centuries. Every time we pick up a well-made tool, every time we appreciate the balance of form and function in a carefully crafted object, we participate in the legacy he helped to create. Theophilus, the monk craftsman, whose writings preserved so much ancient knowledge, achieved a different kind of immortality. His words survived when his monastery crumbled. His techniques lived on when his tools were buried. His understanding of the marriage between spiritual devotion and skilled labor continues to inspire those who seek meaning in their work. In setting down his knowledge for future generations, he demonstrated something profound about the human desire to teach, to share, to ensure that hard-won wisdom does not die with its discoverer. The mysterious marks we explored, those tiny symbols etched into cooling metal, represent something that perhaps we need more of in our own time. The impulse to add meaning to utility, to invest even the humblest work with significance, to leave traces of individual humanity in collective endeavor. Whether they were prayers or signatures, protective charms, or simple pride of authorship, they remind us that the impulse to create goes beyond mere necessity. The castle smith, for all his skill and importance, reminds us of the complex relationships between power and service, between those who make and those who use. His story is not just medieval history, but a parable for our own time. When the people who design our devices and grow our food and maintain our infrastructure often remain as invisible as those ancient craftsmen who armed knights and built cathedrals. As sleep claims you more completely, let the sound of ancient hammers fade into silence. The workshops grow dark, the forges cool, the busy hands finally rest. Yet something persists, not the clash of metal on metal, but the quieter rhythm of human creativity, the steady heartbeat of the desire to make. It's a shape, to leave the world a little more useful and beautiful than we found it. The village where our blacksmith labored has been empty for centuries. Its houses collapsed, its fields returned to forest. But on quiet nights, when the wind moves through the ruins, some say you can still hear the faint echo of hammer on anvil. The ghost of honest labor that once filled these places with purpose and sound. It's a gentle haunting, if haunting it is, not the restless spirit of unfinished business, but the peaceful persistence of work well done. The monastery where Theophilus wrote his careful instructions has also fallen to time. Stones scattered, its library dissolved. But somewhere in workshops around the world, craftsmen still follow techniques he described, still struggle with the same challenges he faced, still finding the marriage of skill and dedication something that approaches the sacred. The castle where the unnamed smith armed generations of knights stands yet, though, as a museum rather than fortress. Tourists walk through halls where armor once gleamed, past windows that once looked out on bustling courtyards full of horses and men-at-arms. The forge is cold now, its bellows silent, but the stones still bear the marks of that ancient industry. Scorch marks on the walls, or patterns on the floor where generations of smiths stood to ply their trade. These places remember in their way. The very stones hold traces of the heat and labor that once filled them with purpose. In the gentle democracy of ruin, lord and servant are equally forgotten, their grand distinctions dissolved in the patient work of time and weather. What remains is simpler and perhaps more true, the evidence of human effort, the marks left by hands that shape the world one careful blow at a time. As you drift deeper into sleep, carried by the rhythm of your own breathing, your own heartbeat, remember that you too participate in this great chain of making. The bed that holds you was shaped by human hands. The building that shelters you was raised by human effort. The very language in which this story is told was forged in the workshop of human communication across millennia of use and refinement. Tomorrow you will wake to your own labors, your own opportunities to shape and make and contribute to the great human project of creating meaning from chaos. Beauty from raw materials, connection from isolation. The tools you use may bear no maker's mark, may give no hint of the hands that shaped them. But they carry forward the same impulse that drove those medieval craftsmen to their forges each dawn. The rhythm continues, the ancient rhythm of human effort, of skills passed from teacher to student, of materials transformed by knowledge and care into objects that serve and delight. It's a rhythm as old as the first stone tool, as persistent as the human desire to make tomorrow better than today, as gentle as the breath that now carries you into dreams. Sleep well, knowing that you rest in a world shaped by countless forgotten hands, warmed by fires lit by countless unknown craftsmen, protected by the accumulated wisdom of generations who understood that the true measure of a life lies not in the recognition it receives, but in the useful beauty it creates. Let the echo of ancient hammers fade into silence. Let the glow of forge fires dim to darkness. Let the patient work of centuries dissolve into the peaceful realm of sleep, where all hammers rest and all anvils grow cool, and all the makers, great and small, known and unknown, find at last the rest they have earned through honest labor. The making never truly ends. It only pauses, gathering strength for tomorrow's work, tomorrow's transformation, tomorrow's small miracle of human hands, shaping the world into something a little more like home. Sleep now. The forges of the world will burn again when you wake, but for now, all is quiet. All is rest. All is the gentle peace that comes after good work well done.